There is a moment that every person who was in the Regent Hotel in Sydney on the 1st of June 1988 will carry for the rest of their lives. Ricky May had just finished his set on the opening night of a new cabaret show. The audience rose. The standing ovation filled the room the way standing ovations only do when something has genuinely moved the people giving it, when the clapping is not polite but necessary. When a room full of strangers finds itself unified by the simple fact of having witnessed something extraordinary. He took his bow. He left the stage. And then, in the wings of the Regent Hotel, the heart that had powered the voice for 44 years stopped. He was pronounced dead on arrival at the hospital. The last thing Ricky May ever heard was an audience on their feet for him. Colleen had been there for all of it. The marriage in December of 1964, the years in Australia building a career from nothing, the clubs and the cabaret venues and the television slots and the touring and the grinding daily work of being an entertainer who was loved by audiences and not always kind to himself. The weight that climbed year by year and never came back down. The health warnings from doctors that were heard and not quite acted upon. The daughter, Shawnee, who grew up watching her father perform, and her mother managed the space between the man on stage and the man at home. Colleen Ann May died on the 17th of August, 2017, at the age of 75. She had been a widow for 29 years. She left behind her daughter, who spoke in 2020 about her mother's life in the years after Ricky's death, the things she had turned to for comfort, the way grief reshapes a person in ways that the person who caused the grief never lives to understand. This is the story of Ricky May, but it is also the story of Colleen, because you cannot understand what his life cost without understanding who was standing beside him when he built it. Richard Ernest May was born on the 22nd of November, 1943, in Onehunga, Auckland, the son of two musicians. His father, Keith May, known to everyone as Kachi, was a saxophonist who led his own dance band called the Rhythm Rascals. His mother, Rachel, was a pianist. She died when Ricky was 11 years old. That loss is the first thing you need to know about who Ricky May became, because it shaped everything. A boy of 11 who loses his mother, who has been growing up surrounded by music and the warmth of a home built by two people who loved their craft, suddenly finds himself in a house where one of the people who made it musical is gone. He had siblings. He had his father. He had the Lever hit parade on the radio and the knowledge of how music was made, sitting in with the Rhythm Rascals from the time he could reach the drums. But he did not have the person who had given him his first understanding of what music felt like when it came from someone you loved. He compensated with performance. By 15, he was playing at the Picasso Coffee House in Auckland, a cafe and nightclub where the audience could tell the difference between a teenager with a good voice and a teenager with something more than a good voice. He had both, and what the Picasso audiences understood almost immediately was that the second thing was what made the room tilt sideways when he sang. He was not merely technically accomplished, though the voice was a genuinely exceptional instrument, capable of the Louis Armstrong growl and the Nat King Cole smoothness and the full-body physicality of someone who had grown up learning that music was not a performance, but a conversation. He could make a room feel like it was the most important room in the world, and that he was singing specifically to each person in it. This is the gift that cannot be taught, the thing that the Picasso audiences recognized before they had words for it. He was 17 years old, and he already knew how to reach people. He drummed, too, and played piano. In 1961, jazz pianist Ronnie Smith assembled a group to play at the Sorrento Club in Wellington, and Ricky May came along to play drums and sing. There was a young man in the audience at those Wellington gigs who would come every night, and who was sometimes invited up to play drums when Ricky put down the sticks to stand at the microphone. His name was Bruno Lawrence. He was another musician trying to find his way, and the Sorrento gigs were where he found it, taking the seat that Ricky May vacated and discovering that he could hold it. The two young Maori musicians from Auckland crossed paths in Wellington and went on to build careers that would define New Zealand's cultural landscape for decades. Bruno Lawrence became an actor. Ricky May became a star. And the woman who would hold the starring place was not yet in the picture, but she was coming. He moved to Sydney in 1962. He was 18 years old, and he had nothing but the voice and the knowledge of how to use it. And in Sydney in the early 1960s, that turned out to be enough. The cabaret circuit received him. The television studios received him. By the mid-1960s, he was hosting 10 on the Town, a nationally broadcast pop music show that put his face in living rooms across Australia every week. He was funny and warm and inexhaustibly entertaining, the kind of television presence that viewers describe as someone you felt you knew, even if you had never been in the same room. In December of 1964, he married Colleen Ann Roser. She was 22 years old. He was 21. They had known each other through the Sydney entertainment scene, the world of clubs and touring, and the particular community of performers who understood each other in ways that people outside it rarely did. Colleen was not a performer herself in the professional sense. She was the woman beside the performer, and in the arithmetic of the entertainment world, that role is both essential and invisible in ways that the performer rarely fully understands. What Colleen understood, from the beginning, was what she was choosing. She was choosing a man whose career would always fill a room first and leave the space at home for whatever was left. She was choosing the touring and the absence and the particular loneliness of waiting for someone who belongs at a cellular level to the public. She was choosing the late nights and the irregular hours and the specific difficulty of being the person who holds the household together while the person who is supposed to share the holding is on a stage somewhere, making strangers feel loved. She made that choice. She made it in December of 1964, and she maintained it until the 1st of June 1988, which is 23 years of maintenance. And she maintained it in the particular way of women who love men who are larger than the ordinary domestic scale can contain. She gave him a daughter. They named her Shawnee. And Shawnee grew up watching what it meant to be the family of Ricky May. The weight was always there. It was part of the image, in a way that the entertainment world of the 1960s and 70s could accommodate in ways that it might not today. The big man with the big voice and the bigger personality. The Maori entertainer who carried his people's warmth and humor and musicality in a body that took up space and insisted on being noticed. He released a duet single in 1983 called Built for Comfort, I Ain't Built for Speed, with the television comedian Jonathan Coleman, and the joke was affectionate and self-aware, and also, underneath the laughter, a statement of something he could not say any other way. He was not built for speed. He was built for the long night in a warm room, for the cabaret show that started at 10 and ended when the audience was ready to let go, for the kind of performance that asks everything of a body, and then asks a little more. He was built for endurance, and endurance was what he gave his audiences, show after show, year after year, the voice never quite declining in the way that performers' voices usually do when their bodies are under sustained pressure. But the body was under pressure. The doctors said things that Ricky May heard and chose not to fully receive, the way performers do when the alternative to performing is a silence that feels like extinction. The cardiac risks that obesity carries were not theoretical in the 1980s. They were documented and understood, and Ricky May's doctors were not vague about them. He was told. He knew. Colleen knew too. She had been watching the weight for 20 years, watching the body that housed the voice carry more and more of the burden that the performances demanded, watching her husband choose the stage over the rest that the body required. She was not passive about it. She said what wives say when they are frightened, and the person they are frightened for will not be still long enough to hear them. He heard her the way performers hear everything that is not an audience, imperfectly, intermittently, with one ear always turned toward the room where the people were waiting. In 1986, he played Nicely Nicely Johnson in the Australian revival of Guys and Dolls at Sydney's Her Majesty's Theatre. It was the role that everyone who saw it would remember for the rest of their lives. Nicely Nicely Johnson is, in the architecture of that musical, the comic large man, whose moment comes in the second act with Sit Down, You're Rocking the Boat, the gospel-inflected number that brings the house down in every production that has ever staged it. Ricky May brought it down. He brought it down with the specific combination of vocal power and physical comedy and genuine emotional investment that only a performer who has spent 30 years finding the truth in a song can bring to a 2-minute number in a West End musical. The reviews were ecstatic. The audiences were on their feet. Guys and Dolls gave him the kind of theatrical recognition that his television work and his cabaret career had not quite managed to codify. The critical acknowledgement that this was not just a popular entertainer, but a genuine artist of the stage. He was 42 years old. His heart had 2 years left. Colleen was watching. The Australia that Ricky May worked in for 25 years was a country that loved its entertainers with the specific warmth of a place that understood what good company meant on a Saturday night. Hey Hey It's Saturday was the embodiment of that warmth. The program that ran for nearly 3 decades and became a kind of ritual for the Australian families who gathered around the television on Saturday evenings and let the room fill with the particular comfort of people who were very good at making other people feel better about being alive. Ricky May was a regular. He was not the host, and he was not the star of the show in the way that Daryl Somers was the star, but he was the person whose appearance on the couch or at the microphone shifted the temperature of the room in a way that the production team noticed and the audience felt. He was beloved in the specific way that a performer is beloved when people have watched them for long enough to feel that they know them, when the face on the screen or the voice from the stage has become part of the texture of a life. When he died, Hey Hey It's Saturday dedicated a special to him. A Little Sugar, a tribute to Ricky May, aired on Channel 9 in July of 1988, 6 weeks after his death. Daryl Somers, who had worked with him for years and who had received him onto the Hey Hey set dozens of times, was among those who paid tribute. The New Zealand entertainment industry flew its flags at half-mast, in the metaphorical sense that these things happen. The coverage, the obituaries, the acknowledgments from colleagues, the particular silence that descends on an industry when someone who is genuinely irreplaceable is gone. In New Zealand, the Benny Award from the Variety Artists Club, the highest honor available to a New Zealand variety entertainer, had been given to him in 1988. It arrived just before he died. He received the highest honor his country could give a performer of his type, and then, within months, the country that had given it was writing his obituary. Colleen read all of it. She sat in the house in Sydney where they had built their life and read the tributes that came from Australia and New Zealand and from the people who had loved him in Las Vegas and in Europe and in the Southeast Asian cabaret circuit where he had performed in the years before the television work dominated his schedule. She read what the world said about the man she had chosen in 1964, and she sat with the distance between what the world said and what she knew. What she knew was the weight and the warnings and the choices he had made about what to prioritize. What she knew was the years of watching a man she loved build himself into the person the public needed him to be, and the cost of that building, and the places where the building had leaned on her in ways he had probably never fully accounted for. She was 46 years old. She had a daughter. She had 29 years left. And she had the particular grief of a woman who loved someone who loved the audience more than he loved himself, and who had watched, without being able to stop it, as that love became the thing that finally consumed him. Shawnee May grew up. She built her own life, in the way of children who carry their parents' stories without being crushed by them, or at least trying not to be. In 2020, she gave an interview to ABC News, in which she talked about her mother's life in the years after Ricky's death, about the things Colleen had turned to for comfort, about the Falun Gong movement that had given her framework and community and meaning in the decades of widowhood. Shawnee did not speak badly of either of her parents. She spoke with the careful honesty of a person who has spent years finding the language for something complicated, who has learned that love and disappointment can occupy the same sentence without one canceling the other. She spoke about her mother as someone who had dedicated herself to a man and a family, and then, when the man was gone, had needed to find a way to keep going in a world that no longer had the shape she had built her life around. Colleen Ann May died on the 17th of August, 2017. She was 75. The obituary notices were brief. She was identified primarily as the wife of Ricky May, the New Zealand singer who had died in 1988. Her own 29 years of life after his death were contained in a subordinate clause. This is the way these stories usually get told. The performer at the center, the family at the edges, the wife reduced to a category in the biographical record, while the man she loved takes up the whole frame. Ricky May was extraordinary. The voice, the warmth, the 30-year career that stretched from a Wellington club where a young Bruno Lawrence was watching in the audience, to the Regent Hotel stage where an audience rose to its feet and he took his final bow. All of that was real and earned and worthy of the tributes that came after. But Colleen was also real. The marriage was real. The daughter was real. The 23 years of holding the household while he held the audience were real. The 29 years of going on after he was gone were real. The choice she made in December of 1964, knowing what she was choosing, and honoring that choice for the rest of a life that outlasted his by nearly 3 decades. There is a quality to the grief of a woman who buries a man who burned himself out. It is not the grief of the sudden and the unexpected, the kind that arrives like a collision when there was no reason to anticipate the impact. It is the grief of the anticipated, which in some ways is harder to hold. You have been waiting for it. You have watched the body take the risks and absorb the consequences. And some part of you has known, with the specific knowledge that love and proximity give you, that the day was coming when the heart would not hold. And then the day comes, and you find that knowing it was coming does not make it easier. You find that 23 years of watching and worrying and waiting did not prepare you for the silence of a house without the person who filled it. You find that grief does not respect the anticipation that preceded it. Colleen found that. She found it in a Sydney house in June of 1988, and she lived with what she found for 29 years, until the 17th of August 2017, when the living stopped. The Benny Award sat somewhere in the house during all of those years. The photographs, the recordings. The 4 albums and the singles and the television specials and the tribute program and the memories of the people who had been in the rooms when he sang. Ricky May had given his life to making people feel that the room they were in was the best possible room to be in. He had done it from the age of 15 until the age of 44, and he had done it with a consistency and a quality that nobody who saw him perform ever forgot. What he had not given enough of was the care of the body that made the voice possible, the rest, the quiet, the acknowledgement that a man who burns at the heat he burned at needs something to sustain the flame, and that the something cannot always be the audience, because the audience goes home at midnight, and the body is still there in the morning with its debts. He left those debts to Colleen. Not the financial kind, though the life of a touring entertainer is never entirely secure, but the deeper kind, the debt of care that was not taken, the years of warnings not acted upon, the heart that was given to every room full of strangers, and not quite sufficiently to the room at home with the woman who had chosen him in 1964. She paid the debt. She paid it for 29 years, in the specific currency of a woman who outlives the man she loved, and has to build a new relationship with time, which now has more of it than she knows what to do with. The standing ovation at the Regent Hotel on the 1st of June 1988 lasted until Ricky May was in the wings, and then past the wings, and on the way to the hospital, and then on the way to wherever the voice goes when the body finally gives out. The audience did not know what was happening in the wings. They sat back down in their seats and felt the particular warmth that follows a performance that has genuinely reached them. The warmth of having been in the presence of something rare. The satisfaction of an evening that delivered more than it promised. Outside, the ambulance was coming.
New Zealand's greatest voice, born in Wanahunga to 2 musicians, shaped by the loss of his mother at 11, trained in the Wellington clubs where Bruno Lawrence watched from the audience and took the seat he left behind, built into an Australian institution by 25 years of cabaret and television and theatrical work that culminated in a role in Guys and Dolls that people are still talking about 35 years later, was being taken away from a hotel that had just given him his last standing ovation. Colleen was told. Shawnee was told. The daughter who had grown up watching her father perform and her mother hold the space between the performer and the man was told that there was no longer a space to hold. The audience never saw any of this. The audience had gone home warm. That is the bargain that performers make with the world, and the bargain that the people who love them make by association. The world gets the performance. The family gets everything that the performance costs. Ricky May's cost was his life at 44. Colleen's cost was 29 years of what came after. Shawnee's cost is the story she carries, the one she told in 2020, the one that is still not widely enough known in the country that gave her father the highest honor it could give, and then reduced her mother to a subordinate clause in his obituary. He was New Zealand's voice in Australia for 25 years.
She was the woman who made it possible for him to be. The standing ovation was for him. It should have been for both of them. There is a photograph somewhere in the archives of Australian television from the 1980s. Ricky May on a stage, mouth open, body fully committed to the note he is reaching for. The audience in front of him and the lights above him and the whole room tilted in his direction. He is big and warm and completely at home in the most public possible space. The space where the self dissolves into the performance, and the performance gives the self back multiplied. Colleen is not in the photograph. She is never in the photograph. She is in the house, or in the dressing room, or on the phone managing the logistics of a career that requires logistics, or putting Shawnee to bed, or waiting for the show to end and the man to come home. This is the architecture of the entertainer's life. The stage and the home. The performance and the person. The light that falls on the performer and the dark outside that frame, where the family waits.
Ricky May spent his life in the light. He earned it, and he inhabited it, and he gave it everything he had. He gave it, finally, everything his body had, which turned out to be the last thing he could give. And he gave it on a Tuesday night in June at a hotel in Sydney with an audience on their feet. But the light that fell on him came partly from Colleen. 23 years of the steadiness that allows a performer to perform, the ground beneath the stage that holds everything up. She held him up. She held their daughter up. She held the whole architecture of the life together while he gave the performance. New Zealand remembers Ricky May. It should also remember that somebody made it possible for him to be remembered. Her name was Colleen. She lived. She loved. She outlasted him by 29 years. She deserves more than a subordinate clause. The Maori musical tradition that Ricky May carried into the Sydney cabaret scene in 1962 was not something he wore as a costume or deployed as a marketing strategy. It was what he was. His father, Kachi, had built the Rhythm Rascals from the understanding that music was a communal act, that the relationship between the performer and the people in the room was not transactional, but reciprocal, that what you gave the audience was what they gave back to you, transformed by their attention into something larger than what you had brought. Ricky May had absorbed that understanding before he was old enough to name it. The Maori tradition of performance that he inherited was one of wakaaro, of thinking through feeling, of making the interior life available to the people in the room through the vehicle of music. The great Maori performers of his generation, the Howard Morrisons and the John Rawlses and the Rhonda Bryarses who would come a decade after him, all understood this. They were not merely entertainers in the commercial sense. They were carriers of something that their communities needed carried, ambassadors of a culture that the mainstream of Australian and New Zealand life was only beginning to understand and value. When Ricky May stood in front of an Australian audience in the 1960s and sang, he was doing something more than performing a cover version of a Nat King Cole standard. He was saying, with every note and every gesture and every piece of Maori warmth that came through the performance, that his people could do this.
That the voice from Onehunga could hold its own against any voice that had ever come from anywhere else. That the boy whose Maori mother had died when he was 11, who had learned music from a father with a saxophone in a band called the Rhythm Rascals, who had played drums in Wellington clubs while Bruno Lawrence watched and waited his turn, could stand in front of the camera on 10 on the Town and make the people watching feel something real. He was doing this in Australia at a time when New Zealand's cultural export to the world was primarily sheep. The entertainment industry of both countries was only beginning to understand that it had artists of genuine international quality, that the voice that John Rolls had found, or the presence that Howard Morrison commanded, or the instinctive musicality that Ricky May brought to every room he entered, were not regional quirks, but universal gifts that happened to have come from the South Pacific, rather than from New York or London. Colleen understood this before most people did. She had married a man who was going to be significant, who was going to carry something important into the rooms he entered, and she had made her peace with the fact that the rooms were going to be someone else's rooms, and the people in them were going to be someone else's people, and that her own room would be the one he came home to when the performance was over. She made her peace with it, and she held it for 23 years. The television career that Ricky May built in Australia across the 1960s and 70s was built on the kind of work that audiences reward with loyalty,
but industries often undervalue: the work of being present. He was present on the Don Lane Show. He was present on the Midday Show and on Farnham and Byrne, and on the Saturday programs that filled the afternoons with the particular warmth of live entertainment. He was present on Hey Hey It's Saturday in the years when that program became the Saturday ritual for millions of Australian families. He showed up. He was good. He did it again the following week.
This is the unglamorous arithmetic of a long career in entertainment, and it is the arithmetic that most performers cannot sustain, because it requires not just talent, but stamina. Not just the voice, but the will to use it consistently. Not just the ability to fill a room, but the discipline to fill it again and again and again, when the room is different, and the audience is different, and the self is tired. Ricky May sustained it for 25 years. Colleen sustained it alongside him. This is the thing that the career summary in the biographies does not capture. That a career of this consistency does not just require the performer's commitment. It requires the household to function in a way that releases the performer to perform. It requires someone to manage the logistical complexity of a life that is always partly elsewhere. It requires someone who can hold the daughter and the bills and the domestic reality of being alive, while the person whose name is on the marquee is at the venue going over the set list. There is a particular skill in being the person who holds the infrastructure of a performer's life together, and it is a skill that is almost never publicly acknowledged, because the infrastructure is invisible by definition. It works because you cannot see it working. The audience sees Ricky May at the microphone, easy and warm and apparently unburdened, and what they do not see is the 23 years of Colleen making it possible for him to stand there looking unburdened. She made it possible. He did not always make it easy. The weight was the most visible sign of the ways in which Ricky May was not kind to himself, but it was not the only sign. The touring schedule was another. A man who had been told by his doctors that his cardiac risks were significant and that rest was not optional was maintaining a schedule that most healthy performers half his age would have found demanding. He was in the clubs and the theaters and the television studios and on the international cabaret circuit in Las Vegas and in Europe and across Southeast Asia, and the schedule left very little space for the rest that the body required. Colleen watched the schedule. She said what she said. He heard what he heard. The show went on. In 1983, he released an album called Fats Enough, a tribute to Fats Waller, with the Julian Lee Orchestra on the ABC label.
The title was a joke, the kind of self-deprecating humor that a large man deploys to get ahead of what other people are thinking, to take ownership of the observation before someone else can make it land badly. He was built for comfort, not for speed. He was Fats Enough. He could laugh at himself. But underneath the laugh was the reality that the title was pointing at, the reality that Colleen lived with daily, and that his doctors had framed in clinical language, and that the Australian entertainment industry managed by simply not discussing. He was a large man whose body had been carrying more than its optimal weight for years, and the cardiovascular consequences of that were not things that a sense of humor could deflect. The album was acclaimed. Fats Waller's music was a natural fit for Ricky May's style, the stride piano tradition and the Armstrong influence coming together in a set of interpretations that showed exactly what he could do when the material matched the voice. The follow-up, a tribute to Louis Armstrong released in 1987 called Just Foolin' Around, was even more praised. Both albums found him at the full height of his interpretive powers, doing the thing that musicians describe as telling the truth of a song, which means finding the version of the material that could only have come from this particular singer in this particular life. The recordings are the clearest evidence of what was lost when the Regent Hotel took his final bow. They document a voice that had been developing for 30 years and was, in its final iteration, at the height of what it could be. There was a warmth in the later recordings that only comes from age and experience, the knowledge of what a song is really about that you cannot fake and cannot accelerate and cannot arrive at except by having lived enough to understand it. He had lived enough to understand it. He had just not lived carefully enough to have more years to do it. The Guys and Dolls production at Her Majesty's Theatre in Sydney in 1986 was the peak of the theatrical chapter of Ricky May's career. The role of Nicely Nicely Johnson is one of those musical theater roles that belongs in a specific category, the supporting character who stops the show. The character is not the romantic lead, not the protagonist, not the person whose journey the audience is following.
He is the large, warm, comic character whose moment in the second act arrives with "sit down, you're rocking the boat." And if the actor playing him is genuinely capable of delivering that number, the entire production benefits from the resulting heat that fills the theater. Ricky May was genuinely capable. The reviews understood what they were watching, which was a performer who had spent 30 years developing the specific combination of vocal power, physical comedy, and emotional honesty that the role demanded. He did not imitate the famous performances that preceded his. He found the version of Nicely Nicely Johnson that lived inside Ricky May's particular experience of music and faith, and the warmth that he had inherited from a father with a dance band and a mother who died when he was 11. The audience rose. They had been rising for him for 30 years, in different rooms and different countries and for different material. But the Guys and Dolls audience was perhaps the most significant of the risings, because it happened in the context of theatrical criticism, in a room full of people who were paying attention in the specific way that theater audiences pay attention. And what they were paying attention to told them that this man was not merely a popular entertainer, but something more considered and more lasting than that. He was 42. He had 2 years left. He could not have known that. Colleen was there for the opening night. She was always there for the opening nights. The person in the audience who was watching the performance and also watching the man inside the performance, reading the signs that the audience could not read, understanding what it was costing, and also understanding that the cost was being paid willingly because the stage was where Ricky May most fully existed. She watched him take the bow. She watched the theater do what the Regent Hotel would do 2 years later. She was present for all of it, the whole long arc of the career, from the Wellington clubs where it really began to the Sydney stage where it reached its fullest expression. She was the constant in all of those rooms. He was the variable, the element that changed with the material and the mood and the audience and the year. She was the thing that did not change, the still point around which the whole career turned. After he died, the industry did what industries do.
The tributes came quickly and sincerely, from people who had worked with him and people who had watched him, and people who had simply been in rooms where he performed and had not forgotten what that felt like. The Benny Award sat somewhere in the house. The recordings were available for people who wanted to find them, though finding them required some effort, because Ricky May's catalog was not the kind that streaming services promoted aggressively to new listeners. Colleen built a different kind of life. She found, in the Falun Gong movement, a framework that gave the years after his death a structure, and a community, and a set of practices that provided what grief at its most extended requires. Something to do in the morning, something to believe in the afternoon, something to hold on to in the hours when the house is quiet, and the person who used to fill it is not coming back. Shawnee watched her mother find her way. She watched from the particular vantage point of a daughter who had grown up in the household of a performer, and had her own feelings about what that childhood had been, about the ways in which the career had dominated the domestic space, about the things that the audience's love for her father had displaced within the family. She did not speak badly of him. She loved him. But she also told, in the 2020 interview, the truth of what it had been like to grow up in the household of Ricky May, which was the truth of a household organized around a career and a man who burned himself out serving that career. The truth was not simple. It never is, in families built around someone who belongs partly to the public. The love was real. The music was extraordinary. The warmth that Ricky May brought to every audience was the genuine article, not performed, but actual. A quality that came from somewhere deep in who he was, and that the people who received it were right to treasure. But the warmth costs something to produce and to sustain, and the cost is not always paid by the person producing it. Colleen paid some of it. Shawnee paid some of it. The household paid it in the particular currency of accommodation, of making space for the man whose career required space, of learning to live alongside someone who was always partly elsewhere, even when he was in the room. This is not a condemnation. It is a description. Most great performers operate this way.
The gift that makes them great is also the thing that makes them difficult to live with, because the gift requires a kind of singular focus that domestic life cannot fully accommodate, and the domestic life must therefore adjust. The people who love the performer do the adjusting. Colleen adjusted for 23 years. Then she adjusted to the absence for 29 more. 52 years of her adult life shaped by the presence and then the loss of Ricky May. The recordings remain. This is the final gift that performers leave, the thing that outlasts the body and the grief and the tributes and the industry's short attention span. The voice is there in the grooves and the digital files. Ricky May in his full expression mode, doing what he had been doing since the Picasso Coffee House in Auckland when he was 15, which was making the people in the room feel that the room was exactly the right place to be. That's enough. Just fooling around. The live performances that were filmed for television specials and are held in the archives of Australian broadcasting. The recordings from the New Zealand television special of 1983, the show where he acknowledged his Maori heritage with a medley of Pokare Kare Ana and Hoki Mai, connecting the Auckland boy who had grown up with the Lever Hit Parade and the Rhythm Rascals to the broader stream of Maori music that Rhonda Bryars and Howard Morrison were also carrying at the same moment. When John Rolls introduced Rhonda Bryars as the voice of New Zealand at the Royal Variety performance in 1981, he was passing forward something that had been established partly by Ricky May's 2 decades of work in Australia. The Maori voice in the mainstream of Australasian entertainment was not an accident. It was built, performer by performer, show by show, room by room, by people who understood that the gift was real and that it needed to be presented with the confidence that real gifts deserve. Ricky May presented it that way from the day he first stood at a microphone in the Picasso Coffee House to the night he took his final bow at the Regent Hotel. He was consistent in his confidence and his warmth and his willingness to give everything the performance required. And what it required, in the end, was everything he had. He gave it. Colleen received what was left.
The standing ovation on the 1st of June 1988 was the last roomful of people who got to feel what it was like to have Ricky May in it. They went home warm. The warmth has been fading slowly ever since, the way all warmth fades when the source of it is gone. But it is not entirely gone, because the recordings are there, and because the people who were in the Guys and Dolls audience in 1986, or the Hey Hey audience in 1983, or the Sorrento Club in Wellington in 1961 still carry the memory of what it felt like. And because Colleen carried it for 29 years, in a Sydney house, after the man who had made all of those rooms warm had taken his final bow and stepped into the wings and not come back. She deserved the standing ovation too. She never got one. There is a particular thing that happens when a performer dies young. The career freezes. The recordings stop accumulating. The voice that was still developing, still finding new depths and new registers and new ways of reaching the people in the room, stops at whatever point it had reached when the body gave out. And the people who loved the performer are left with the recordings that exist, which are extraordinary and irreplaceable, but which do not include the recordings that would have come. Ricky May was 44. In the world of jazz and cabaret, 44 is not old. It is the age at which a voice like his, shaped by 30 years of performance, would have been entering its fullest maturity, the stage at which the technical accomplishment and the emotional depth and the hard-won knowledge of what a room needs and when it needs it combine into something that cannot be manufactured or accelerated. Tony Bennett was still recording masterpieces in his 80s. Ella Fitzgerald was transcendent in her 50s. The great vocal interpreters of the jazz and pop tradition grow into their voices the way that writers grow into their prose, and the growth requires time that Ricky May did not have. What the recordings capture is a man at 44 who is already extraordinary. They do not capture the man at 54 or 64 who would have been the sum of everything he had learned and everything he had survived, including the weight and the cardiac risk and the doctor's warnings and the choice to keep performing anyway. That man does not exist in the archive.
He was cancelled on the 1st of June 1988, in the wings of the Regent Hotel, before the audience that had just risen for him had finished sitting back down. Colleen knew the man at 44. She had known the man at 21 and at 30 and at 40, and she had watched the arc of what he was becoming with the specific attention of someone who was close enough to see both the gift and the cost of it. She had watched him become more assured and more emotionally available in his performances in the later years, the way performers do when they have accumulated enough experience to stop trying and simply trust. She had seen what was coming in the artistic sense, the version of Ricky May that the Guys and Dolls performance was pointing toward. She had also seen what else was coming, and she had been right about that too. The house that Colleen and Ricky had built in Sydney was a house that performers built, partly functional and partly theatrical, a space for being a person as well as a space for being a performer, with the inevitable blurring between the two that happens when a life in entertainment is lived over decades. There were the photographs and the posters and the professional memorabilia that accumulate around a career, the evidence of rooms and stages and television sets and the people who had been in those rooms with him. There was the personal evidence too, the daughter's drawings and the family photographs and the small domestic objects that mark the passage of ordinary time. The house was both. It was the house of Ricky May the entertainer and the house of Richard Ernest May the man, and Colleen had to find a way to live in it when only one of them remained. She stayed in Sydney. She did not retreat to New Zealand, to Wonehunga where he had been born, or to the Bay of Plenty, or the Wellington of the Sorrento Club. She stayed in the city where they had built the life together, because the city was also hers, because Shani was there, because leaving would have required a kind of decisive break with the past that grief does not always have the energy to make. She found the Falun Gong community in Sydney. It offered something that the entertainment industry's grief did not: a philosophical framework, a set of practices, a community of people who were not connected to Ricky May's career, and who received her simply as Colleen. She could exist in those rooms without being the late singer's widow.
She could be herself, which is a thing that 23 years of being primarily someone else's wife had made occasionally difficult. This is not said as a criticism of what she had chosen or how she had chosen to inhabit it. She had loved Ricky May. She had chosen him freely in 1964, and she had honored that choice for the rest of his life. And she had grieved him properly and thoroughly for the rest of hers. The Falun Gong community was not a replacement for what she had lost. It was a different kind of belonging, one that did not ask her to be the woman beside the performer, but simply the person who showed up. She showed up for 29 years. Shani's account of her mother, given to ABC News in 2020, is the closest thing we have to a portrait of Colleen from the inside. It is not a comprehensive portrait. It is the portrait that a daughter draws of a mother, which is partial and personal and shaped by the daughter's own experience of what it meant to grow up in that household and to watch what happened to the woman at the center of it after the man she had organized her life around was gone. What the account communicates, between the lines and sometimes in them, is the picture of a woman who had spent her adult life in service of a relationship and a career, and who found, when the relationship ended, that the service itself had become the structure of her identity. The question of who Colleen May was when she was not the wife of Ricky May was one that she was still working on when she died at 75. This is not unusual. It is the experience of a generation of women who built their lives around the careers of their husbands in a way that left them, when the husbands were gone, in the position of having to discover or rediscover what they themselves contained. The women of Colleen's generation who had done this were not passive or simple. They had made choices with full knowledge of what the choices entailed, and they had honored those choices with a commitment that deserved more recognition than it usually received. Colleen had made her choice in December of 1964. She had stood in a room full of people celebrating the beginning of her marriage, and she had promised to honor and to love and to hold in all the ways that those words mean when they are spoken by a person who takes them seriously. She took them seriously. She held him. She held the household. She held the career. She held Shani.
She held it all for 23 years, and then she held the absence, which is a different and harder thing to hold, for 29 more. The standing ovation at the Regent Hotel on the 1st of June 1988 was the audience's way of saying, "We have received what you gave us, and we want you to know." It was the public's acknowledgement of a transaction that had been building for 30 years, the accumulated warmth of 1,000 performances in 1,000 rooms, given back in the only currency that a room full of people can offer. Colleen never got that currency. The exchange between the performer's family and the performer is private and unacknowledged and does not produce standing ovations. It produces ordinary days and difficult years and the quiet life of a woman who outlasted her husband by 29 years and built the best second chapter she could from what the first chapter had left her. The second chapter deserves its own acknowledgement, not as an appendix to the story of Ricky May, but as the story of Colleen Ann May,
who married a man who burned bright and died young, and who spent the rest of her life figuring out who she was when the brightness was gone. She figured it out. She found her community and her practice and her daughter and the grandchildren who came later and the ordinary daily textures of a life lived without a performer at the center of it. She lived until 75, which means she had 31 years of life after the Regent Hotel, and whatever those years contained, they were hers in a way that the years before had been divided between herself and the career she had served. She is not remembered primarily for those years. She is remembered in the biographical record as the wife of Ricky May, the woman who died in 2017, survived by her daughter, who had been married to the singer who died in 1988. But she was more than that. She was the person who made it possible for Ricky May to be Ricky May for 23 years, and who then found a way to be Colleen May for 29 more. That should be part of the record too. The voice is still available. That is the miracle of recordings, the thing that Ricky May could not have fully understood when he was making them in the early 1980s. That the voice he was laying down in those ABC studios would still be available to people who had not yet been born when he sang. That's enough. Just fooling around.
The television specials in the New Zealand archive, the tributaries of a career that is still flowing 40 years after the Regent Hotel. New Zealand knows this voice. The generation that grew up with Hey Hey It's Saturday and the Don Lane Show and the cabaret tradition of the 1970s and 80s knows what it sounds like when Ricky May opens his mouth and lets the room receive him. They know it in the way that you know a voice that has been present in your life at the moments when you were most receptive, when you were young and the world was being constructed around you, and the things that filled the domestic spaces became the furniture of your interior life. He filled the Saturday evenings. He filled the clubs and the theaters and the television programs. He filled the rooms with the specific warmth that was his and no one else's. The Maori jazz singer from Onehunga, who had learned music from his father's dance band and developed it in the Wellington clubs and brought it to Australia and given it to a country that needed it more than it knew. And beside all of that, in every room that was not the stage and every year that was not the performance, was Colleen, the woman who had chosen him in 1964. The woman who had held what needed holding and let what needed going go. The woman who had watched the career and the body and the doctor's warnings and the choices, and who had said what she said and been heard imperfectly and held the household anyway. She held it until she could not. Then she held the absence. The standing ovation was for Ricky May. This story is for Colleen. Keith May, known as Kachi, died before he could see what his son became at the full height of the career. He had been the first musician in Ricky's life, the saxophonist who led the rhythm rascals around the dance halls of Auckland, and who gave his children the understanding that music was not a luxury, but a way of being in the world, a language more reliable than most, because it reached the people it was addressed to in ways that ordinary language did not always manage. Ricky had inherited this understanding so completely that it was impossible to say where the inheritance ended and the instinct began.
He was a musician in the Kachi May tradition, committed to the room, committed to the people in it, committed to the proposition that what you brought to the performance and what the audience brought to the receiving of it together created something that neither party could have made alone. This is the tradition that the great jazz performers live in, the tradition of Louis Armstrong and Fats Waller and Nat King Cole, the singers who had shaped Ricky May's musical identity from the time he was a teenager sitting in with the Rhythm Rascals. They were performers who understood that the technical skill of the voice was in service of something larger, that the notes and the timing and the phrasing were the means and not the end, and that the end was the moment when the room felt the thing the song was actually about, rather than merely hearing the notes the song was written in. He had achieved that in the Guys and Dolls production. He had achieved it on Hey Hey It's Saturday in a different register, the comic register, the version of the same transaction where what the room feels is warmth and recognition, rather than the particular gravity of a ballad sung well. He had achieved it in the tribute albums to Fats Waller and Louis Armstrong, in the studio recordings where the audience was the microphone and the producer, and the eventual listener who would encounter the track years after it was made, perhaps in a different decade, perhaps in a different country, perhaps by someone who had never been in a room with Ricky May alive. He was making those recordings for Shawnee, though he did not know it. He was making them for the grandchildren who would come later,
for the people who would need to know what the voice sounded like. He was making them for the archive, for the record, for the simple fact of having been here and having made something that could outlast the making. He made enough, not as much as there should have been, not the 50 years of recordings that a voice of that quality deserved, not the maturity albums of the kind that the great interpreters make in their 60s and 70s, when the technique has become so internalized that it disappears and leaves only the truth of the song. But enough. Enough to know what was there. Enough to hear what the rooms heard when he walked in. Colleen heard all of it. She heard it from the inside, which is a different kind of hearing than the audience receives. The audience hears the performance.
The person inside the performer's life hears the preparation and the aftermath. The morning before the show, when the voice is warming up. The night after the show, when the adrenaline is still present and the body is beginning to feel the cost of what it has given. She heard the versions of the songs that did not make it to the recordings, the 3 o'clock in the morning versions, the half-awake versions, the versions that were not performance but simply Ricky May being musical, because musicality was the grammar of his existence, and he could not stop using it any more than he could stop breathing. She heard the voice in the kitchen, and the voice in the car, and the voice in the early morning when he was thinking through something, and the thinking came out as music. She heard 23 years of the private version of the voice that the audience paid to hear, and it was different from the stage version in ways that she would have had difficulty explaining and that no biographer or critic could have captured. The private voice is always different. It is smaller and more tentative and more honest because it is not working to reach the back of the room. It is working only to reach the person who is actually present. And when the person who is actually present has been married to you for 20 years, the voice knows that the technique is not required and can relax into something closer to what the technique was always trying to express. She heard that voice. She was the only person who consistently heard it, who was present for the years and the shows and the mornings after. She was the audience of one that every performer has if they are lucky, the person who receives not the performance, but the performer, who knows the difference between the two and loves them both. She had that for 23 years, and then she had the memory of it for 29 more. New Zealand has a particular relationship with its exported talent. It produces extraordinary people with a consistency that suggests something in the landscape and the culture, and the particular mixture of Maori and Pakeha that the country has been negotiating for 2 centuries. And it watches those people leave for Australia or Britain or the United States, and does not always follow carefully enough what they do when they get there. It celebrates the departure with pride and the obituary with grief, and the space in between is sometimes not attended to as well as it might be.
Ricky May was exported to Australia in 1962 and was not imported back until the Benny Award in 1988, which arrived in the same year as his death, and which therefore served as both an honor and an obituary. He had spent 25 years building a career on the other side of the Tasman Sea that made him a genuine star in Australian entertainment and a representative of New Zealand's cultural capacity in a market that was paying attention. And New Zealand had watched from a comfortable distance and said, "Yes, that's our Ricky. He's doing well over there." He was doing extraordinarily well over there. He was doing the specific thing that New Zealand musicians of his generation did when they left. He was demonstrating to an audience that was larger and more critically demanding than the domestic one, that what had been grown in the soil of Wonhunga and the Wellington clubs and the particular musical education of a Maori boy whose father had a dance band was something that could hold its own in any room in the world. He held it for 25 years. And when he was gone, Australia mourned him with the particular warmth of a country that had received something it had been given rather than something it had grown, which is a more conscious warmth, more aware of its own good fortune. New Zealand mourned him too, in the brief and guilty way of a country that sometimes understands what it had only when it is reading the obituary. Colleen read the New Zealand obituaries. She had spent 25 years building a life in Australia around a man whose country was always on the other side of the Tasman, always the origin story, always the identity that preceded the Australian career and gave it its particular flavor. She was not a New Zealander herself, or at least not by birth, but she had been married to one for 23 years, and she had absorbed the particular qualities that New Zealand had given him: the warmth, the community orientation, the refusal to take himself so seriously that the audience could not relax,
the Maori cultural inheritance that gave the performance its roots. She had also absorbed the New Zealand tendency to undervalue what it had until it was too late to do anything about the undervaluing. The Regent Hotel still stands. It has been renamed and refurbished and reimagined in the way of large hotels in large cities that must adapt to successive economic and cultural moments.
The room where the standing ovation happened is no longer the same room. The people who were in it have dispersed into their individual lives, carrying the specific memory of that opening night, the warmth of the voice and the generosity of the performance, and the strange retrospective weight that the memory acquired when the news came through that Ricky May had died in the wings. They remember. Some of them remember. The ones who were old enough to understand what they were witnessing when they were witnessing it, who had enough experience of live performance to recognize that the man at the microphone was operating at a level that most performers never reach, and that the standing ovation was not courtesy, but genuinely felt. They remember the warmth, and they remember the sound of the applause, and some of them probably remember the specific moment when the mood in the room shifted from celebration to something else. Colleen was not in that room, or perhaps she was. The record is not clear about whether she attended the opening night, and the record is often not clear about where the performer's wife is, because the record is compiled with the performer at the center and everyone else in relation to that center. She was somewhere. She was in Sydney in June of 1988, in a life that was about to change in the way that lives change when the person at the center of them is removed without warning on a Tuesday night. She had been preparing for it and not preparing for it, in the way you prepare for something you know is possible but cannot fully believe will actually happen, the way you live alongside a fear for years and manage to continue functioning by keeping the fear in a specific compartment of the mind and not opening that compartment on ordinary days. The doctors had said what they said. The wait had been what it had been. The choices had been made. She had said what she said and been heard imperfectly and held the household anyway. And then the phone call came, or the person arrived, or however the news arrived, it arrived, and the compartment opened, and the fear that had been in it for years turned out to have been the accurate prediction of a thing that was always going to happen. He was gone. She had the rest of her life to live. She lived it. That is the whole story, and it is not a small story.
It is 29 years of a woman finding out who she was without the person she had defined herself in relation to, finding out what she believed and who she loved, and what she needed from the days and the years and the community around her. It is the story of Shawnee, growing up and finding her own life, and giving her mother grandchildren, and eventually giving the world an account of what it had been like inside that household, the honest account that daughters give, when they have enough distance from the lived experience to trust themselves with the truth of it. It is the story of the Benny Award, sitting somewhere in a house, the voice preserved in recordings that are in the National Archives of 2 countries, the memory alive in the people who were in the rooms. And it is the story of Colleen, the woman who made the standing ovation possible, who never received one herself, who deserved one more than she was ever given. There is something specific to be said about the way that the cabaret tradition in which Ricky May worked treats its performers. Cabaret is the most intimate of the popular performance forms. It is not the stadium, where the performer is a distant figure on a lit stage and the audience is a mass responding collectively. It is not the theater, where the fourth wall creates a formal separation between the world of the performance and the world of the audience. It is a room with tables and drinks, and the performer within touching distance, working without the safety of distance, required to earn the attention of people who have other things to do and other conversations to have, and who are nonetheless sitting in your room and waiting. The cabaret performer earns the room every night, from the beginning. There was no credit carried from the previous night's show. There was no audience that came because of a review they read. There was only the room as it is tonight, and the performer as they are tonight, and the negotiation between the two that constitutes a cabaret performance at its best. Ricky May won that negotiation, night after night, for 25 years. He won it in Sydney and in Auckland and in Las Vegas and in the Southeast Asian circuit and in Europe. He won it with the voice and the physicality and the humor and the warmth and the Maori cultural inheritance that gave everything he did its particular flavor,
the quality that people described after the fact as something they had not seen before and did not see again. Not quite, not in the same combination. The cabaret tradition is also the tradition of the entertainer who keeps going, the performer who is present whether the body is cooperative or not, who treats the obligation to the audience as inviolable in a way that the obligation to the self is not always treated. This is the tradition that killed Ricky May, in the specific sense that the tradition's demands were more compatible with a body that had been maintained than with the body he was maintaining. He kept the obligations to the audience. He did not always keep the obligation to himself. Colleen knew this tradition. She had married into it, and she had watched it operate for 23 years, the way the performance always came first, the way the room at the end of the night was the room full of strangers rather than the room at home with the family. She had accommodated this without ever quite accepting it, in the way that long marriages accommodate the things they cannot accept, by finding a way to hold the accommodation and the resistance simultaneously and continuing to function. She functioned. She continued. She held the household and the daughter and the career infrastructure and the knowledge of the doctor's warnings and the fear that lived in the specific compartment of her mind that she did not open on ordinary days. She held all of it together for 23 years, and then she held it alone for 29 more. This is what it costs to love a performer who loves the performance more than he loves himself. You receive the warmth that he generates in every room he enters. You receive the recognition that comes with being beside someone that people love. You receive the particular quality of life that comes from proximity to genuine talent, the way that talent illuminates the ordinary days and makes them less ordinary. And you pay the price that the talent extracts, which is the price of coming second to the room full of strangers, of being the constant in the equation while the performance is the variable, of outliving the person who lit up every room he walked into and finding that the rooms are darker afterward and stay that way. Colleen paid that price.
She paid it fully and without complaint that reached the public record, which is the only record we have of what she said and thought and felt across those 52 years of her adult life that were shaped by Ricky May's presence and then by his absence. The public record is incomplete, as the public record always is. It contains the dates and the albums and the television shows and the Benny Award and the opening night at the Regent Hotel and the standing ovation and the death in the wings and the daughter's account in 2020. It does not contain the evenings at home or the conversations between people who had been married for 20 years or the specific texture of what it meant to be Colleen in the household of Ricky May. That texture is gone. It went when she went, on the 17th of August, 2017, at 75, survived by her daughter, who knows what the texture was, and who carries it now, adding it to the Waka Papa that her father carried from Onehunga to the stages of Australia, and that her mother carried through the 29 years of widowhood, and that she herself carries forward into a present that neither of her parents lived to see. The voice is in the recordings. The story is in the telling. This is the telling. The last thing to say about Ricky May is also the first thing to say about Colleen. When John Rolls introduced Rhonda Bryars as the voice of New Zealand at the Royal Variety performance in 1981, he was passing forward a tradition that Ricky May had helped establish in Australia over the previous 2 decades. The Maori voice in the mainstream of Australasian entertainment had been built by the performers who preceded Bryars, and Ricky May was among the most significant of those builders. He had shown, by 2 decades of consistent and acclaimed work in a demanding market, that the voice that came from Onehunga could fill any room it entered, and leave the people in it changed in ways they could not quite account for. Rhonda Bryars did the same thing for a generation that came after. Howard Morrison had done it before. John Rolls had done it alongside. These were the carriers of a tradition that New Zealand produced and Australia received, and the world eventually recognized, when it got around to recognizing what had been in front of it all along. Ricky May was part of that tradition, and was also, in his 44 years, a singular expression of it, something that the tradition produced only once and cannot produce again, because the specific combination of the voice and the warmth and the father's dance band and the mother's piano and the Wellington clubs and the Sydney cabaret circuit and the 23 years with Colleen and the daughter named Shani and the body that carried it all until the 1st of June 1988 was a configuration that existed exactly once and will not occur again.
Colleen Ann May lived alongside that configuration for 23 years and watched it from a distance for 29 more. She knew it from the inside in ways that the recordings cannot capture and the biographies cannot reach. She knew the man behind the performer, and she chose him and held him and let him go when the holding was no longer possible, and then held the memory of him for the rest of her life. She deserved the standing ovation. She deserved the tribute program. She deserved the biography that told her story as something more than an appendix to his. She deserved to be remembered as Colleen May, the woman who chose him in December of 1964 and honored that choice for 52 years, for longer than the man she chose was alive. She did not get those things. She got the subordinate clause in the biographical record, the line that says his wife Colleen Ann May died on the 17th of August 2017, survived by her daughter Shani. She deserved more. This is a small part of the more.